Okay, hi everyone. This is Survey of the Nonprofit Sector, Lecture 2, Civic and Political Engagement. So the outline for this lecture, first we're going to talk through some historical political theories of association. Then we're going to talk a lot about social capital, talk a bit about civic engagement and political engagement, and then we're going to finish off with global engagement. Okay, there's 6 ways that nonprofits are linked to the political process. This is in Frumpkin chapter 2. So starting here at the left, the least partisan form of action in the least partisan ways that nonprofits affect politics is first they build social capital in communities. Next, they encourage civic engagement. They support political participation, and then we get a little bit more partisan. Nonprofits advocate for causes, they lobby for legislation, and then finally they can even finance campaigns. So, political theories of association. First, I think as we go back historically, it's good to remember that the modern nonprofit organization is a relatively recent innovation and a 20th century legal construct. Before there were nonprofit organizations, people were voluntarily creating associations centered around a variety of topics. This could be the trade guilds that organized around their work. This could be associations that organized around a hobby or education. And then obviously people organized around religion and associated and got together around these different topics. Theorists have argued whether these voluntary associations helped create and maintain democracy or whether they were a hindrance to it. So a lot of the theories were kind of go back and forth with different ideas as to whether voluntary association helps or hurts democracy. One thing to keep in mind though, empirically, as we look around and observe which types of governments have the most private and voluntary associations, we can kind of see that non-democratic governments, they severely restrict or outlaw voluntary organizations. So that kind of gives a hint as to whether it's good for democracy, but as we proceed here, you'll see quickly that there's lots of good and bad reasons, or good and not so good reasons for whether we think voluntary associations help democracy. So starting out, we have Thomas Hobbes. He lived from 1588 to 1679. In Hobbes' view, the state had good reasons to be suspicious of non-governmental associations. When you are with an association, you learn organizational skills, you build a sense of community, and these things, these building skills, gaining community, this challenges the state's claim to power. So Hobbes was a little bit suspicious of associations and what that meant for the power of the state. As we go on, we have John Locke. He lives from 1632 to 1704. Locke is part of the classic liberal tradition, which has always been really concerned with individual rights, including the right of association. He stressed that the right to associate is not contingent on the permission of the state or any other authority. It's a given right that all of us have. So it's something that you can't deny, and if you do, you're undermining freedom. Next, we have James Madison, who's one of the founding fathers, and the word that he used a lot in his writing was he talked about factions, but in as far as we're concerned, this is very similar to the role of associations. He observed that the zeal for different opinions would lead to conflict and would make it hard for factions to cooperate. He argued that the Constitution gave the various factions enough room to express their views and a chance to influence government. The word that we often use for this is pluralism. So instead of the majority imposing its will on minorities, the multiple interests expressed in factions would negotiate the differences and arrive at a solution in which the majority would rule, but adequate regard would be given to the views of minorities. Another well-known founding father was George Washington. In his farewell address, Washington saw danger in groups devoted to shared interests and warned against, quote, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities. Washington believed that associations were likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. Okay, so if we kind of compare Washington and Madison, Washington was kind of like Hobbes. He was a little bit leery and worried that through associations, certain people would gain power beyond those who were given authority through democracy. Next, we have John Stuart Mill. Mill was part of the classic liberal tradition, and he argued that voluntary associations deserve protection because they build the character of the individual. Mill believed that voluntary associations were a means by which people achieved mental education, a mode of strengthening their active faculties, exercising their judgment, and giving them a familiar knowledge of the subjects with which they are thus left to deal. He went on to suggest that associations were important to individuals because they fostered debate within the marketplace of ideas. Okay, moving on, we have Alexander Dunlop Lindsay, or often known as A.D. Lindsay. He lived from 1879 to 1952. He had kind of an interesting take, and I think one that is kind of interesting and relevant today. Not to say that the other theorists' ideas aren't relevant today, they certainly are. But he said the isolated individual is always powerless against great organizations. The ordinary man must have his own discussion group if his personality is to hold out against the molder of mass opinion and the petty tyranny of officials. So his perspective was that, if we don't have groups, it's harder for us to stand up against, this big bureaucracy that we have to deal with. And then finally, we have Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French diplomat in political science. Many consider to be, the best, most important and influential sociologist. Maybe before sociology was called sociology, but he wrote Democracy in America, and one of the main questions of that was, how can one account for the fact that America is truly a democratic nation? So in addition to the laws we created and the fortunate circumstances that were here, it was the equality of Americans developed in associations that enabled democracy. Because Americans have civil associations, they are able to establish the political associations crucial for government. And this is a quote. He said, Americans of all ages, all stations of life, and all types of dispositions are forever forming associations. There are not only commercial and industrial associations in which I'll take part, but others of 1,000 different types. In every case, at the head of any new undertaking, or in France, where you would find a government, in the United States, you are sure to find an association. So here's kind of a diagram of Tocqueville's theory. So first, starting over here, we have each man is equal. They associate, and then through those associations, they create mores or customs or ways of living, which then goes on to influence political associations along with the civil associations. And all of this combined leads to democracy. Okay, so directly, equality leads to democracy, but indirectly, these civil associations and mores or customs created through those civil associations also lead to and support democracy. Okay, as we get kind of a little bit more contemporary, we have Robert Nisbet in the Pluralist School. So he lived from 1913 to 1966. So in contrast to the liberal democratic tradition of Locke and Mill, the Pluralist School conceives the role of association somewhat differently. So instead of seeing the individual as the basic unit of society, the Pluralists argue that small groups are the fundamental building blocks of society. And that if we focus just on the individual and their rights, we're going to miss one of the most important parts of democracy. So here's a quote. He said, "The liberal values of autonomy and freedom of personal choice are indispensable to a genuinely free society, but we shall achieve and maintain these conditions only by vesting them in the conditions which liberal democracy can thrive: diversity of culture, plurality of association, and division of authority." And you'll know I brought up this idea of pluralism. So pluralism, you have multiple groups competing for attention and for power. And according to Madison, that was a good thing. And Nisbet tends to agree that small groups are important, and that's how we have democracy. And then finally, we have C. Wright Mills, who was around the same era of Nisbet. But Mills had a critique of the pluralist school. And at the heart of this was the belief that forming competing groups within society would lead to diffuse and ineffectual opposition to elite domination. So Mills was like Marx, or considered a Marxist. If you haven't heard of Marx or need to brush up quickly, Marx's theory was that his perspective was that the history of the world was a series of clashes between those in power and those who are not in power, or the elites and the non the elites. And this perspective explains the history and society better than anything else. So from this perspective, Mills feared that by associating, it would placate individuals, it would give us a false sense of participation, and it would divert us from our real task, which was to question the power of elites. So by having a pluralist society where there's multiple groups competing against each other, we're distracted from the real issue, which is competing with the elites who are in power. So I know that was a lot, but there's a lot of meat and a lot of discussion to be had as you think about these different philosophers and theorists. So first, Hobbes versus Locke. Is the individual right to associate more important than threatening the stable order, the stable social order we have created? On one hand, you could say these rights are inherent, but on the other hand, this stability that we've achieved in society, sometimes we might take it for granted, and by letting things go too much, we might lose that stability. Then we have Mill. He said that participating in voluntary associations teaches us democracy. How does that work? What things do we learn in voluntary associations that teach us how to live in a democracy? Sometimes, if you've lived in a democracy your entire life, these things seem inherent, but they're not necessarily something we're born with. They're things that we learn as we grow up in a democratic society. Then Lindsay, what examples of voluntary associations protect us from government bureaucrats or, this monolithic bureaucracy? If you start to think, you can come up with, quite a few examples, and this is actually quite an interesting perspective. Madison versus Washington. Would allowing factions protect minority interest, or would they be engines by which people seeking power would subvert the government? And then finally, Nisbet versus Mills. Does pluralism provide the division of authority for social order, or does pluralism distract and weaken us from the main conflict in society, which is the elites versus the non-elites? Okay. Now that we've talked about a little bit of the history of political theory as it relates to associating and how that kind of prepared the way for nonprofits, let's continue our discussion about how nonprofits are linked to the political process. I'm really going to focus a lot on social capital because I think it's a really important topic, and it kind of leads to the other ones. So as we have social capital, we tend to get more civic engagement, we get more support for political participation. So it really is kind of the building block and fundamental thing we need before we can get any of these other parts. Okay, so nonprofit organizations are important in building what scholars call social capital, or the bonds of trust and reciprocity among a group of people that seem to be prerequisites for democratic polity and a market economy to function effectively. Okay, so I'm going to give you a lot of definitions of social capital, and we're going to talk about it from a few different perspectives. Okay, so what is social capital? So first of all, think of it as, let's first talk about this term capital. So capital is anything that is a resource. So commonly we talk about financial or economic capital, right? To start a business, you need capital, you need money to start, to buy your building, to pay your employees. You need something to start with. That's economic or financial capital. You might talk about cultural capital, right? Do you know about the culture? Do you have respect among people in your culture? And what does that do for you? We often talk about human capital. There's a few different perspectives there. Human capital, you could think of that as the workers in an organization. That's definitely a great resource. Or you could think of it as the knowledge and skills that is within that group of people. You could take two different groups of people, and those two groups may have completely different skills within each group. But when we talk about social capital, there's two really important ways to think about it. So first, we can think about it as an individual characteristic. So this would be your individual network, the people you know that could help you out in some way in the future. You might also think of social capital as something that a group possesses. So what is the internal strength or closeness or goodwill within or among a group? This could be an organization, and this could be even at the societal level. Okay, so again, let's think of this in two ways. First, an individual's network, and then second, the closeness or goodwill that's among a group of people. So let's get into some definitions. So as far as individual social capital, Bourdieu in 1985 said that it was the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance or recognition. Maybe a bit more simply, Burt in 1992 said that social capital could be the friends, colleagues, and more general contacts through whom you receive opportunities to use your financial and human capital. And then other scholars focus more on collective social capital. So we have Putnam, who said that it was the features of social organizations such as networks, norms, and social trust that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit. That was in 95. And then in 97, Brehm and Ron said social capital is the web of cooperative relationships between citizens that facilitate resolution of collective action problems. We're going to talk more about collective action problems later in the class, but again, we have these two different forms of social capital. Often you'll hear scholars talk about them as the same thing, but I really think it helps to distinguish the two different ones, and we're going to talk about how we study maybe these two different types of social capital and also what these two different ones give us. But again, coming back to this idea of social capital as capital, first, like all other forms of capital, social capital is a long-lived asset into which other resources can be invested with the expectation of future, albeit uncertain, flow of benefits. So for example, if you have some financial capital, you can invest that with the expectation that in the future it's going to be worth more. Same thing with social capital. If you keep investing in it, in the future it's going to give you dividends. Second, as capital, social capital is productive. Okay, so it's a resource. It's only really good for us when it produces things for us. Third, like other forms of capital, social capital can either be substituted or can complement other resources. So, for example, if you don't have a lot of financial capital to start a business, but you have a lot of social capital and the people in your network do, you can use that maybe, and they could loan you maybe at a cheaper rate than a bank would, and then you now have financial capital to start your business. Okay, so it can substitute or complement these other forms of capital. Fourth, like physical and human capital, but unlike financial capital, social capital needs maintenance. Okay, so if you don't keep in contact with the people in your network, maybe they would be less willing to help you out later on. And if it's been years and years and years and you're no longer friends, maybe they may not be as willing to help you. Okay, unlike financial capital, right? You can put the money in the market and it kind of sits there and it kind of is as useful as the market is powerful, right? And as much as it's worth and the market thinks it's worth, that just happens. You don't have to do anything about it. So that's different from whereas human capital, right? If you think of human capital as the skills that humans have, right? If you don't continually refine those, right, you might lose a bit of it, right? Like, at one point we all had to learn like algebra, right? But if you put a tricky algebra equation in front of me, I might not be able to do it as well as I could when I was doing it a ton in 7th grade. Okay, so we have to maintain human capital, social capital, physical capital, but not as much financial capital. And then finally, some have argued that social capital is unlike other forms of capital in that it's not located in the actors, but in the relations of the actors, right? So sometimes you'll say, well, it's my network, okay? But it's not just your decision. Each relationship you have with someone in your network, it's also a decision that they have to accept you in their network as a friend, right? And so social capital is not located as something I have. It's shared between me and the people in my network. And if they decide to end it, it's over, right? And so actually social capital is found in the link between people, not in the people themselves, which leads to kind of an interest that's really interesting, right? It's not something that any single person owns. And this is true for both individual and collective social capital. It's, I've been talking about this from the individual perspective, but also think about this from a collective perspective. Even the group of people don't own the social capital within themselves. The social capital is found within the links that all the people have to each other in that group. Kind of a crazy thought, but it's important because it's something that's kind of ethereal. It's not something I can touch. It's just something we kind of sense and feel, which also makes it a little bit hard to study, right? How do you judge, or how do you get an understanding of a thing that doesn't exist, isn't a tangible thing? So, which leads us to the next point. How do scholars study social capital? So a few simple ways they have historically is looked at how are people participating in associations. We kind of make the assumption as if people are participating in associations, they are building social capital as they associate with each other. Another way we might study is try to study its effects, right? If we can understand how much people trust the government, we assume that that trust comes from social capital. That may or not be a good assumption, but that's an assumption we make in those types of studies. Kind of in a similar vein, we could look at tax morale, which you can think of as the level of tax fraud in a country, right? If I'm willing to give my country money, that says something about how I feel about all the people that I'm here in the country with. And then finally, we have network analysis, which is a very common, maybe the most popular way to try to study social capital. So a very famous recent study on social capital was by an author, Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. Excuse me. And he did a big study of American participation in civic associations, community groups, organized religion. And he noticed that volunteering and association and participation in all these groups has dropped off since the 1960s. You could even make the argument that it's continued to decrease. One thing that's kind of unique about this, though, right, is as sort of the rise of the internet, we also associate in ways on the internet that we didn't before. So now there's kind of the question, are we now just associating over the internet and not in person? And is that still the same? Does that give us the same type of social capital that going and associating in person did? People have criticized Putnam for this, where the assumption is that social capital bubbles up from the bottom, but it's also true that as we participate in the formal institutions of government, we also build social capital. So you can also think of social capital as a top-down thing. So again, this is chicken and egg, right? We need social capital to have the trust to actually pull off democracy, but at the same time, as we associate with each other within a democracy, we hopefully reinforce the social capital we already had. Now, we're living in a time where you could argue that's not true. It's actually weakening our social capital, and which makes it a really interesting time to study questions like this. Okay, network analysis is a really popular way of trying to understand social capital. So if you look here, this is someone's LinkedIn network. So you have this guy, Rob Bogue, here in the middle, and these are all the different people that he's linked to through his, looks like SharePoint or the blue, Microsoft, what's that, Crow network, his church network over here, his publishing network, right? And you can see that some of these networks are connected to each other. Some are not, right? So no one in his church network seems to be associated with his SharePoint network. So just as I'm kind of looking at this picture, I can start to kind of understand what the different groups in his network and how they associate with each other, okay? People do this with Survivor. I love Survivor, so I had to bring this in, but you can look at, here's like someone trying to understand the different groups within a Survivor game and how they're linked to each other. So network analysis is a systematic effort to examine the structure of relationships in a network. So often this is done of social networks, right? We can study the networks of people, but you could also do this with networks of countries, right? How do the different countries relate to each other? So if I come back, I skipped that. Okay, well, I'm going to go on because I'm already at 26 minutes and I promised you I wouldn't go over 40. So what it said in the last slide was we can study networks in indirect ways, right? So the example in the last slide was I can look at all the emails that have been sent within an organization and I can see who's emailing who, what are the group emails, who are the people in those group emails, and I get a sense of what is the network like in that organization. In the same way, I could look at trade between countries, who's trading with who, what countries are in, have trade networks, how do those trade networks work with each other. And so there's indirect ways to study networks. There's also direct approaches with surveys if you're studying a social network. So you could ask people, name all the people in your network. Name all the people that you go to for technical information, or who do you go for advice, right? How often do you talk to them? How often do you get help from them? So if you ask enough people and then you start to say, I nominate someone in the survey and they also nominate me, now the researchers can see, okay, there is a tie, there's a link, there's two people who nominated each other. And then they say, well, yeah, we talk to each other daily. Well, if we each say we talk to each other daily, that's a stronger tie than someone who says, yeah, I meet with them and I talk to them once a month. And then the cool part about this is as we gather data like this, we can start to see who plays an important role in a network. So a bridge would be an individual who fills a structural hole. Think of this as someone who sits between two clusters, right? And that's a really important role because you are now connecting two separate groups and you're kind of the bridge between them. Centrality refers to the group of metrics that trying to quantify the importance or influence of a particular node or person within a network. How central am I in the network, or am I sort of out on the outside? A density is the proportion of direct ties in a network relative to the total number possible, right? So if you think about a network of people, they could all be connected to each other, or they could all be connected to one person in the middle but not connected directly to each other, right? So if they're all connected to each other, that's a very dense network. Now, if you think about in terms of collective social capital, if everyone in the network is connected to each other, you might assume that there's more collective social capital there because they all know each other, right? Whereas if there's a central person and everyone's only connected indirectly through that central person, maybe that group doesn't have as much collective social capital because they're so reliant on one person in the middle. And then structural cohesion refers to the minimum number of members who, if removed from a group, would disconnect the group. So again, coming back to the example, if you have one person in the middle who is linking everyone else, you take them out, no one's connected anymore, right? Whereas if you oppose that versus a network of where everyone's connected to each other, if I take someone out, it doesn't really matter because everyone's already connected to each other. So when we're studying and we're trying to understand a network, we've kind of developed this idea of strong versus weak ties. So we can recognize the strength of a tie by counting the frequency or the strength of their tie. So a strong tie indicates emotional support, or not just informational support between people. So you could think of this as your friends, your family. So in a survey, you're asking, who do you go to for emotional support? How often do you talk? You can get an understanding of the strength of that tie. Weak ties, characterized by less frequent interaction, often not have as much emotional attachment, but they're easier to maintain, and people can have more of them. So often these weak ties, usually we're talking about acquaintances, classmates, people you might work with. You don't get emotional support from them, but as we're going to see here in a second, weak ties are super important for a well-functioning network. So we have what we call the strength of weak ties hypothesis. So Granovetter came up with this in 1973, and he said that weak ties are particularly important for and useful for innovation because people who are good friends tend to see the same information, whereas people who are merely acquaintances are likely to be exposed to different information. Okay, so if you're only ever interacting with your close friends and your close family, tends to become an echo chamber where you're only getting the information bounced back and forth. Versus when you interact with someone who's in a completely different stage of life or in a completely different place, they tend to have different things going on in their own echo chamber, but when you interact with each other, you experience and you learn about what's going on in their world. That's super important because and we found over and over, weak ties and more weak ties helps with innovation, connecting and helping us get out of the echo chambers. Weak ties, people with more weak ties are likely to lead to better jobs. So again, if you think personally about your own network, right, it's the people in your weak tie network that often can help you get the better job. Okay, so to kind of summarize, the benefits of social capital can lead to job opportunities, skills, knowledge, influence, control, power, solidarity, strong social norms and beliefs, a reduced need for formal controls, right? So this is important, right? If we all kind of trust each other, then we don't have to turn to formal means to resolve conflicts, to deal with problems. We can do it kind of informally. The more we have community social capital, the more civic engagement, the more people are better citizens in their organizations. So in general, social capital is a really good thing. It's not everything though, right? There are risks to this. It takes a lot of time and work to build social capital. If you think about this individually and the power, if you're seeking power, the more your contacts know each other, the more you lose power because they don't need you in the network. I kind of talked about this with strong and weak ties. The ties that bind may also be the ties that blind. The more social capital there is, the more opportunity there might be for free riding and then excessive sharing of resources, and this may hurt entrepreneurship, right? If I can rely on the people in my network for help or for resources, I don't have to strive as hard. It could lead to more tragedies of the commons. So tragedy of the commons, think about the fish in the sea, right? So if we all go fish at the same time and we don't have any check on that, all the fish are depleted and there's no more fish. Okay, so maybe social capital could be a risk for that if we all just kind of trust each other and we don't have a way of regulating how we fish. And then finally, if you have a strong focal group identity, that might weaken the broader whole. And this might be an issue we're dealing with now, right? We have a lot of different identities in our society, and people tend to maybe identify more with those than they do with the larger group. If I don't feel connected to the larger group, why should I care about, supporting it? Okay, so I used social capital as the basis of one of the first journal articles I had published. So my thought was basically, how do online versus in-person students get and use social capital? And my thought was, because it's harder to make friends and meet people online, especially if you're an online student, you're not able to build the network that an in-person student would be able to do. So, because we know that people with stronger networks are better able to get jobs, my thought was, are online students less likely to use their network to get their first job out of college? And so that's what I did. I just asked them, how did you get your first job out of college? Did you use your network? And I found that online students were less likely than in-person students to use their network to get their first job out of college. I didn't ask about the quality of the job. So I don't know whether the jobs were better, but there is a lot of, there have been findings in the literature that jobs that come through network tend to be better than jobs that come through just like your resume. So yeah, what does that mean for us, right? We have online students, we have in-person students, and what this has done for me is it's made me really aware of trying to build the social capital of the students in our class, right? And it's tough. The Zoom students are not here in class and it's hard to get to know each other. This is one of the reasons I'm kind of still a proponent of having the intensive weekends, where we all get to come together and really meet each other. And I've had some great experiences being able to meet the students who were not here in Laramie. Okay. Some discussion questions we might have in class. So does having multiple competing groups help or hurt our democracy right now? And then if we think back about bowling alone, how can we get people civically engaged as we're seeing that it's starting to kind of drop, or it's been dropping for the last few decades? Okay, there are regulations about how different types of nonprofits can advocate or lobby. I don't think I'm going to go through these right now. We're going to talk more about this in class. But there are rules about which types of legally designated nonprofits can lobby, how much they can lobby, how much of their resources and time can go towards lobbying. So yeah, this is table 2.1 in Frumpkin. And then finally, transnational organizations. Nonprofit and voluntary organizations intervene politically in the international context in at least 5 different ways. So this is in addition to like the work that they do for their mission. Some of them their missions might be to do some of these things, but in this sense, I'm talking just generally, what do international nonprofits do politically in the international context? So first, they can identify problems, draw attention to issues that might go unnoticed. They can help build international norms that can guide policy and practice. They can help enforce public policy and norms through public information campaigns and boycotts. They work to resolve conflicts and mediate disputes. And then finally, they mobilize people to take action and become involved in global issues. Okay, so that is lecture 2. I got in under 40 minutes. So we will see you on Tuesday in class. Thanks.